Hi everyone, my name is Milagros Micheli and this is the video presentation of our paper, or better said, our note called Studying Up Machine Learning Data, Why Talk About Bias When We Mean Power, co-authored with Julian Posada and Tianling Yang. In this note, we pose the question, why talk about bias when we mean power? To discuss the limitations of using bias as an umbrella term to describe everything that is wrong with AI. We argue that focusing on bias distracts us from addressing how power is embedded in machine learning datasets and systems. And we bring examples of how the bias framing has been used and has shaped research in data in the context of machine learning, data work, and data documentation. But let's start with machine learning data because understanding what data is and where data comes from is key for understanding the behavior of machine learning systems. But the common understanding of data that researchers have, even within the HCI and CSCW communities, often gets in the way of questioning and understanding data sets. In the hard sciences, we often learn that data is a given, some sort of truth that is indisputable and absolute, that data is something that is just laying around waiting to be collected and not something that is actually created by humans. Machine learning practitioners use expressions as raw data, ground truth data. As researchers, we write things like based on the data the results show to guarantee our findings' quality and factual truth. In fact, data bias has been defined as a systematic distortion in the data that can be measured by contrasting a working data sample with other samples. This is a textbook definition that comes from the same idea of data, that there is an absolute truth value in data and that bias is just a distortion from that value that can therefore be fixed. However, STS and critical data scholars and also some work within HCI and CSCW have a different understanding of data. Data is actually a creation, a product. Data is the product of unequal social relations. This also means that data is never a given or an absolute truth. It is actually someone's truth, one truth over others possible. And in this sense, data is always biased. And here is where the power question becomes more visible, because data encodes the assumptions of those in charge of deciding what information to consider data, where to collect it, how to classify it, and how to label it. As researchers, we know this. We know that in every research project, someone will decide the research question, the method, the sample, and that those decisions will decisively impact the data that we will get and the knowledge we'll produce. And we also know that the person making those important decisions is often the one with the more power. This is often in every research project the PI and hardly ever the student assistant. As I said before, data is the product of unequal social relations and, as such, it is always biased. And data work is one of the arenas in which the unequal social relations that produce data become most visible. Data work is the labor involved in the collection, curation, classification, labeling, and verification of data that is used to train and validate machine learning systems. Very often, machine learning companies and research organizations outsource data work through platforms, but also to BPOs, which is short for business process outsourcing companies. For requesters, outsourcing these tasks is considerably cheaper and faster than having them done in-house. Now, why is it cheaper? Well, that's because when outsourced, data work is conducted under very precarious conditions where most workers are paid a few cents per task and don't count with the protection or benefits related to more traditional employment relationships. It is also cheaper because these BPOs and platforms often target very poor regions of the world and/or especially underserved communities within those regions. Now, in bias research within HCI and CSCW, data workers have broadly been regarded as a problem to be solved, as bias-carrying hazards whose subjectivities are detrimental to data and therefore need to be tamed. As you can see from these paper titles, the goal has been mitigating worker biases by constraining and standardizing their judgment. Instead, we propose discussing the social and the political economy side by situating these workers and their labor in broader institutional and structural arrangements. From this perspective, we argue that the industrial settings in which machine learning data is produced don't allow much room for data workers' biases to broadly affect data sets because their subjectivities, the subjectivities of these workers, are persistently constrained through hierarchical structures so that data is produced according to the instructions provided by clients, according to the desires of those clients. Task instructions and work interfaces are instrumental to impose specific meanings on workers and through their labor on data. As I said before, BPOs and platforms target vulnerable populations and impoverished regions of the world. Data workers' geographical and social contexts are crucial in perpetuating asymmetrical relationships in data work. And these contexts of poverty and vulnerability make data workers dependent on requesters and thus obedient to instructions. So instead of seeking the wisdom of crowds, as crowd work is often advertised, what is done is imposing forms of interpreting and classifying data generally guided by economic imperatives and technical possibilities. So the rationale in terms of creating data is usually what is the cheapest way of doing this and or what kind of data and labels fit the model that I'm trying to create. Now, coming to the last point of our note, in view of the assumptions, worldviews, and values that get encoded in data, in the past 5 years or so, research in machine learning transparency has proposed different frameworks to document data sets. Most of these frameworks are standardized checklists or questionnaires to register datasets' motivation, composition, collection process, and recommended uses. However, as we argue, there are still some challenges in terms of making power encoded in dataset explicit, especially in terms of making visible how asymmetrical labor relations in data work shape what kind of truth a dataset will perpetrate and what other truths are rendered invisible. And we argue that those challenges are rooted in the fact that these documentation frameworks are based on the goal of transparency and also on the goal of bias prevention, which are, as we have seen, quite limiting goals. For instance, one question that is repeated in all those frameworks is about the dataset composition, especially in terms of labeling taxonomies, classes, categories, and the presence of labels for race and gender classification. The problem is that there is no reflection besides the mere act of listing. And just listing doesn't speak to the political work those classifications do, and in fact, documentation, in this case, might serve to reify the existence of those classifications, to make them official. Because once those classifications become official through documentation, they become a thing that exists and can be considered valid. So the question remains, how do we make documentation truly useful and not just a performative act? As I mentioned before, the problem is that these frameworks aim at transparency, which is not bad, but transparency, just like bias, has its limits. So in terms of transparency, it would be enough that we disclose the ingredients of a dataset. But any attempt to make power encoded in data sets and machine learning systems explicit must go beyond transparency and aim at reflexivity in terms of the process in which a data set is produced. And thinking of the process brings us to the main challenge for documentation. That is, that data sets are not fixed entities, but they evolve and change over time. Data production is iterative, and in this sense, documentation can only provide a snapshot of a data set at a given moment. Also, documentation is typically designed for linear communication from dataset producers to dataset users. This is again rooted in the goal of bias mitigation and the assumption that the more specific and narrow the communication, the less the chances for biases. So we propose a shift of perspective from documenting datasets to documenting data production processes. And we argue that documentation should accompany and reflect the process of data production, not just the final product, that is the dataset. In this sense, documentation can and should work as a communication medium that enables feedback loops and transports workers' voices back to the requesters. Finally, this type of documentation can help promote reflexivity and make power asymmetries in data production contexts explicit and contestable. So summarizing, the bias framing is limiting. To study up data, we need to talk about power. To talk about power means to talk about labor. Labor is a key dimension of AI ethics. Now, if the focus of AI ethics is mitigating biases, Then HCI and CSW research that aims at constraining data workers' subjectivities, as I showed a few slides ago, does make sense in a way. However, that research is dangerous as it produces simplistic results that, as it is the case, end up allocating the responsibility for biased data to workers who are vulnerable exclusively, ignoring that the problem is not bias, it is power. So we need to study up, we need to shift the research focus and give place to different research questions. And different research questions require different methods and the collaboration between different disciplines and expertise. And we believe in the potential of the HCI and CSW communities to foster the type of interdisciplinary work that is necessary to advance AI research beyond bias mitigation and identification. But how do we study up machine learning data? When we say study up, we refer to the term coined by anthropologist Laura Nader, that is a call to shift the gaze up and study elites. Similarly, we make a call to expand the field of inquiry to study decision makers, tech elites, and other powerful players and hold them accountable. It is a call to study power in the AI industry, a call to question the data we often consider an absolute truth. We also think that this approach can help flip the script and create spaces where communities that don't often get to participate in the creation of socio-technical systems get to ask the questions and interrogate elites instead of having elites studying underserved populations from afar, as it is typically done in academia. Finally, researchers cannot claim to understand data workers' biases if they have never talked to a data worker, known about the labor conditions they are subject to, or understand the relationship with requesters. Studying up ultimately means moving away from armchair research to get closer to the people and the phenomena we aim at investigating. We hope this work inspires fruitful conversations within our research community. Thanks a lot for watching. Feel free to contact us with your questions and comments.